Good morning and good day to all our participants across the world. We're excited that you've been able to join us for this interesting side event on selecting the most effective instruments to invest in innovation in sustainable agriculture intensification. My name is Irene Anofrenpong. I was the former Director of Research and Innovation for the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa. And I'm currently one of 21 commissioners for the Commission on Sustainable Agriculture Intensification that has been set up under the auspices of the International Water Management Institute of the consortium, Global Consortium of International Agricultural Research, CGIAR. COSI, as we call it for short, was launched in 2020 to investigate current state of investment in agriculture and innovation. And its main aim is to help influence public and private support to innovation in order to rapidly scale up sustainable agriculture intensification in the global south. Of course, to do this, COSI adopts an inquiry approach and therefore put forward 6 big questions to guide COSI activities over the period. And these 6 areas include the future of food and innovation investment priorities, pathways for innovation and environment, and the 5th one, innovation and social and human objectives. And finally, we look at principles and metrics that really touches on the need to guide future innovations in sustainable agriculture intensification in the global south. So these are the big questions that COSI has put forward, and it does that by commissioning specific studies, particularly focusing on bringing sustainability as a core outcome of agricultural innovation and intensification. Of course, recognizing that there is a need to embrace the complexity and adopt multidimensional and multidisciplinary practices to embrace technological innovations. But we are aware that currently there is reduced funding availability, and therefore novel approaches to innovations. And the funding for this are declining. And therefore, one of the areas, particularly the 4th big question for COSI on innovation and environment, is therefore finding the evidence to see how best to support and achieve diverse environmental objectives for sustainable agriculture intensification. So in this context, our study that is going to be the key basis for our discussion today critically evaluates the effectiveness of different instruments and strategies to support novel innovations and processes. I'm going to, in this session, be joined, and I'm excited to have key speakers who come from the Institute of Natural Resources, who are leading this study. And I'm going to be joined by Dr. Bridget Letty, a principal investigator at the Institute of Natural Resources. I'm going to ask all the speakers and panelists to introduce themselves. Then after that, we will go to a panel discussion to discuss the elements emerging from the study. And then we will take a few chat questions and try to pull out some conclusions from this session. So, ladies, gentlemen, greetings once again, and I'm excited to invite our speaker, who will be joined by another one called Dr. Jeffrey Okidi, who is an agricultural economist and lead of the AB Development Division. So let me not take too much time to invite our first speaker, Dr. Brigiletti to give the first presentation. Dr. Letty.
Good morning, Irene, and thank you for introducing, and good morning to everybody else who's joined us today. As Irene mentioned, I'll be sharing some of the results of the study that we're just busy with at the moment on behalf of COSI, and we're looking at effective instruments for innovation investment. Just as a background and building on what had been said already, we were appointed, the Institute of Natural Resources was appointed to undertake the study, leading a team with members from across the globe. We've tried to widen the team and to undertake a study that will provide recommendations to investors and innovation managers about the types of instruments that can provide effective support to agricultural innovation towards achieving sustainable agriculture intensification. And thus far, we have focused on 14 instruments. We avoided approaches that we felt were very broad or tools that we felt were very specific. And that's how we reached our set of 14. I just thought that it was useful to just clarify what is meant by sustainable agriculture intensification. It's about transformative changes in agriculture and food systems that are urgently required to meet rapidly increasing global needs for affordable, nutritious, safe, and healthy food, while protecting and improving the natural environment and promoting resilient livelihoods and social equity. The set of instruments that we've come up with include challenge funds, innovation support funds, prizes and grants, innovation funds, prizes and awards, insurance for innovation because we've realized it's risky, innovation platforms and hubs, farmer research networks, living labs, farmer field schools, incubators and accelerators, results-based funding contracts, as well as brokers or intermediaries. And I just wanted to highlight that our focus is on the use of these instruments specifically to support innovation, rather than to support other elements that they may have been used for in the past. So we really did try to keep it fairly focused. This graphic gives an indication of how the overall program is structured and how the study is structured and what it hopes to achieve. So basically, we sit with a situation where we have investors and innovation managers who are investing in programs that make use of various instruments. And when we talk about instruments, we're talking about those that provide financial support, those that provide non-financial support, for example, building social capital, creating linkages, and then obviously there are those instruments that provide a combination of financial and non-financial support. And when we talk about innovation, we're talking about innovation in its wider sense. So whether we're talking about new products, new seed varieties, new services, mechanization services perhaps, new processes such as certain agricultural practices, new organizational arrangements, and new marketing systems. Those would be the kinds of innovations one would like to see happening in order to achieve a change in agricultural systems towards sustainable agriculture intensification. And the sort of impacts that one wants to see from these transformative systems are multiple impacts. So, for example, both productivity and economic impacts being achieved, but as well as environmental impacts, as well as social and human well-being. So one wants to see a diversity of objectives and impacts. And then for the purposes of this study, we've been asked to look at these instruments. So if you go to the left-hand side of the graphic, and say, well, what is the context in which they've been effective? What was the sector in which they were used? So was it high value crops being produced for export markets, or was it about commercializing subsistence farmers? What is the scale of production in which they were used? And what were the objectives of the programs in which they were used? Were they expected to achieve gender inclusiveness? Were they expected to support youth in agriculture? So that I hope provides a basis for understanding where we were going with the study. Some findings that I'd like to share with you. So firstly, we found that the position along the value chain, the level of commercialization, and scale of production all determine the most appropriate instruments. So for example, innovation hubs are generally used for more high-tech developments, often focused on making data available, often more focused on commercially oriented agriculture, versus something like farmer-driven innovation support funds, which generally are aimed at making resources available for farmer innovators so that they can actively be involved in the process of innovation. Some instruments made use of physical space. So you, for example, incubators and accelerators and hubs that have actually provided working facilities for innovators, while other instruments actually just provide a virtual space or make use of an existing facility to bring different actors together and allow them to co-create. One of the lessons or findings that emerged, which for me was particularly interesting, is this issue of investors wanting to see a return on their investment, and not just a social return on investment, but potentially a financial return on investment. And this is where a number of investors are seeing opportunities in results-based contracts, where they make an upfront investment. For example, that a program will achieve certain reductions in greenhouse emissions or sanitation, because it's used in a number of different sectors. And if the result is achieved, then another investor comes in and pays for that outcome. And thus the initial investor receives their money back and is able to reinvest it. So it becomes almost like a revolving fund. And I thought that those were quite interesting new financial innovations that are in place. Some innovation that's required is not of direct economic benefit to the farmers, but it's of global importance. And we need to try and find ways or mechanisms to incentivize farmers to introduce and test these practices. And it's even more important to de-risk those processes if farmers don't see a direct benefit upfront. And that's where we've started looking at things like insurance for innovation. It's been quite interesting to see that a number of programs make use of multiple instruments to support innovation. So for example, if you were looking at a case where farmer-driven innovation support funds have been introduced to support a group of farmers, you might find that in fact there's also some kind of innovation platform, even if it's at a local level, that's also been established in order to create the linkages and the relationships and to bring different actors together. A number of the instruments are being used in contexts that recognize the roles of users as participants in the innovation process. So whether it's a farmer, or whether it's a person who's a technical person in a small agribusiness, that are actually being seen not as recipients or beneficiaries of innovation processes, but as active members of that innovation process. They're co-creators, and programs or instruments are putting funds into the hands of those farmer innovators or local innovators so that they can actively participate. And they're also brokering relationships between those innovators and other actors, such as knowledge holders or market players, so that they can support that further. Most of the instruments that we've come across recognize, or they function within an innovation systems concept, and they recognize that innovation systems have multiple actors, and they provide mechanisms to bring those multiple actors together to share, to exchange. So whether one's talking about innovation platforms or innovation hubs or brokers that focus on supporting multi-stakeholder partnerships is quite key. And last point on this slide is around transaction costs. And when one reads a lot of the evaluations, there's reference to transaction costs, and there's reference to the cost to the investor relative to the impact that's achieved. But there's often not a lot of attention given to the cost for farmer innovators to participate, for example, or we'll have systems where grants are dispersed via local structures. You have to spend time screening and dispersing funds and monitoring impact. And there isn't always attention given to those real costs when the effectiveness of instruments is explored. And I think that it's becoming clear that it needs to be given consideration. And my final thoughts before I hand over to Joshua. The first question is, what do investors need to consider in order to improve the sustainability of their interventions? So they're spending a whole lot of money and time and resources making use of an instrument and operationalizing it. And how do they make sure that it has a benefit beyond the time frame of the project? So it's been quite interesting for me to come across these local agricultural research committees in Honduras. They're still functioning. It's around 15 years after the program that introduced them ended, and yet they're still there and they're still functioning. And I think we've got to draw lessons from those kind of experiences. Many of these instruments, in fact, lead to institutional innovation. And investors really need to recognize the roles of the different actors that participate in that innovation process, and need to consider how they can support their continued involvement beyond the time frame of that funded program. So, for example, you have innovation platforms that are set up, and many of the actors that participate are only able to participate while it's a funded process. So we need to look at how we can increase the sustainability of these initiatives by looking at success stories from other programs, I guess. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to our initial results. And I really would appreciate if you would share your insights with us today. And let me hand over to Joshua to share some of his experiences from East Africa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bridget, for that comprehensive summary of the preliminary findings from the study. I just have additional observations as highlights that could be or should be key considerations in the process of application of the different instruments, particularly in respect to incubators, farmer field schools, innovation platforms or hubs, innovation funds, but also results-based funding in the context of East Africa. And as those instruments enlisted have been applied in the different sectors. One of the key outstanding considerations is in respect to ownership. And this is for those who are benefiting from the instruments. And ownership across how the different instruments could define this or have it operationalized could come in forms of in-kind contribution or cash contributions, And from the publications we've reviewed, where across the different instruments where this has been applied, it's also linked up with the greater results and achievements, but which also build into sustainability and continuity. So the issue of ownership would really be critical, and it will be important to see how it can be applied based on the context where the instrument is being applied. And it can be in kind or in cash. The other aspect is responsive preparedness, but also capacity building, because just providing the instrument may not be enough. You could find that the beneficiary from the instrument is also at different level in terms of developing their innovations, and along the path, they are finding various challenges or gaps or bottlenecks in terms of knowledge, skills, or even technical requirement. So as the instrument is being presented, it will add a lot of value to understand along the path of innovation development, where the beneficiary is, what are the gaps. And in cases where there was responsive preparedness and capacity building, that also built into the success of the application of the instrument, but also the associated results, and then continuity and sustainability. The other aspect is in respect to quality assurance and standards. And take a situation where the instrument has supported a beneficiary to bring certain products on the market. Definitely, they are illegal products at the same time, which may not meet the standard, but also could present an unfair competition. Because most cases, whereas the markets may have various preferences, there are also other factors like, but also if an illegal product is not meeting all the requirements as provided law.
We can hear you, Joshua.
Certainly yes. And certainly what they bring on the market could be cheaper, which would present unfair competition for a product that has gone through the right policies and the legislative requirements. And then overall that can do the whole effort and investment associated with the instrument. So the issue of quality assurance and standard then comes in handy, but also the beneficiaries will be required to be trained or awareness created on how they can meet the different standards in the market. Then lastly is the role of government as aligned from the different ministries, authorities, and departments. And this comes in handy in terms of regulation and enforcement, but also developing and implementing the required policies which would support the overall innovation development process. And that also means that as the different instruments are applied, it is important to engage the different duty bearers within government to provide that kind of support for the innovation development. Yeah, so in the nutshell, those are some of the key considerations which we saw that were common across all the different instruments, especially those applied in the context of East Africa. So thank you. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. This is brilliant. Thank you, Bridget and Joshua, for presenting this exciting study. We know these are emerging results, and therefore the discussion that follow will be interesting to see how we tackle the issues, as you point out, Bridget, around transaction costs and even position on the innovation to impact pathway being very important. We are talking of transformative changes, so it's important to look at other issues that Joshua raises, issue of ownership and of capacity development, quality assurance. These are all important elements. But let me also remind us that at the end of the day, COSI is trying to influence the investment climate. And therefore, our discussions around this topic should help us to see how we inform investors, taking cognizance of the fact that there are a whole lot of actors along the pathway that also invest in some way, how do we influence that investment climate? So I'm excited to introduce the next session of this discussion. We have 5 panelists to help us to do that. We have Dr. Jeffrey Okidi. I've mentioned him already, an ag economist. And panelists, just take a second to introduce yourselves and then give us very quick inputs. Our second panelist, Dr. Ishmael Sunga, is the CEO of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions, SACAU. Thank you for joining us. Then we have, we had Joshua already, isn't it? No, we have Dr. Joshua Take, Executive Director of Environmental Alert, Uganda. Thank you for joining us in this exciting discussion. We have Madam Karen Munoko, who is the agribusiness development expert in the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa. And finally, but not the least, we have Dr. Majojo Niese, who is a COSAI commissioner and colleague. So this is a panel we have to help us to discuss the emerging results that have just been presented by Bridget and Joshua. I have a few questions that I'll pose to the panelists, and then we will stop to take questions from the chat. And if we have more time, we'll take another round. So let me start with you, Dr. Niese Majojo. We heard from Karen a number of instruments that are available and that give opportunities to improve investments. For example, the grants and prizes for farmers. Those instruments that support farmers, also even the user-led process that we saw in the paper project. What do you think are the benefits for this kind of approach? Do you see any challenges? Very quickly.
Thank you very much, Ariane. You asked us to introduce ourselves briefly. I'm Majojo Niese, Commissioner of COSAI. I'm also a geographer, environmental scientist, and have worked recently on land reform, agricultural production systems, etc. I'm Senegalese and based in Senegal currently. I think I'm very pleased by the presentations made by Bridget and Joshua about the preliminary findings of the study they are doing, because I think that they have taken into consideration the role that farmers are playing and should be playing in the innovation efforts. Because in many cases, say farmers are considered mere recipients of innovation products. And the reality is that the farmers themselves, they are primarily innovators, because for them, innovation, in fact, in some cases, is not even a choice. It is a survival issue, especially if the environmental context is changing. You have to adapt to that environmental context. They are innovating all the time. The question is, how do you support that? Bridget has mentioned in the report that they have covered about 14 approaches, 14 tools, innovation tools. Some of these are directed to creating the condition for farmers to contribute to innovation efforts. One of them is a grant. Another one is, in fact, also the awards and the prizes. With regard to grants, I think on the positive side, innovation has a cost all the time. It's very challenging to pay for innovation. And we know that farmers, especially in Africa, they are in the very, poverty is really what is rampant. So for them to pay the full cost of innovation could be challenging. So it makes sense for them to provide some grant to encourage innovation. The limitation there is that people consider that generally probably having additional costs, the farmers provide costs, and you provide supplementary support that in the form of matching grant would be the most appropriate way to do that. I think that is probably one of the limitations I see with the grant and have seen so far, is that sometimes it's always linked to projects. And where the project ends, the incitation for the farmers to minimize the cost of innovation disappears. In many cases, the effort to innovate also will disappear. That is one of the systemic issue is really a big problem. With regard to the award and the prices, I see many benefits there. First is that it will recognize and to present the innovators are models, are role models, first of all. That is one. And the second is that once it's done also, you are encouraging people to innovate and to be recognized as innovators. Because in many cases, farmers are recognized, are considered as wrongly, as in fact being locked down in the tradition without innovating. So identifying innovators and then having awards, some pricing system, I think that is can be a very effective way of promoting that. I just wanted to make sure that we make sure that instead of considering innovation as a directed process, whether you come and you anticipate what innovating should be, the best and most sustainable way is to create the right environment conditions that will create the incentive for innovation, for creativity. In which case, innovation, the results of innovation can even surprise you because it is unanticipated from the external actor. So creating the right environment for me is key, and in general, it's not covered in the tools. The tools are more instruments, but the right environment for me is a very, very critical issue. If I can end here by mentioning that in the area we're working with sustainable land management and water, I know that there were hundreds of innovations that are there in the store, are not been implemented, not fully implemented. Why is that? You ask the question, is that probably is that you don't have the right environment, you don't have the right incentive. So putting an emphasis on the environment for me, the global environment, that's a policy environment, government environment, financial environment is very critical for me to create the condition for sustainable innovation.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. These are very, very strong points. And indeed, the issue of the point you made that farmers are innovating all the time, and actually they form a big chunk of the actors on the innovation to impact pathway. I think that is something that I think Karen also, Bridget makes a point around the transaction cost. We recognizing how to ensure that all the actors, are supported, that the innovation process has the environment, as you point out, Giorgio, that the enabling environment is in place to drive sustainability. And I think that's where the point that Joshua made around ownership for me is very important, because you need to drive the process in such a way that the actors or the key actors that drive sustainability own the process. That's the underpinnings of sustainability. So how do we continue to find innovative ways of funding or having incentives to drive such innovations? And of course, you point out correctly that the award system is good, but we need to have the environment placed in such a way that there is a continuum as we talk about innovation. Colleagues, this is getting interesting. COSI is about influencing investment climate. And let me turn my attention to Karen now. Karen, you work with FARA, and FARA has done some fantastic things: innovation platforms, user-led processes, living labs, user-led processes. Now, tell us, in your experience, do these approaches help innovations get scaled up? And what do you see as the guiding principles for for these instruments. Karen, just take a second to introduce yourself and quickly respond.
Thank you, Dr. Irene. So I'll briefly introduce myself. My name, as you've heard, is Karen Munokonguru. I'm currently working for the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa as the agribusiness and gender expert. Previously, I've done research in these systems through an approach called the Living Labs, and specifically targeting the metropolitan agriculture. But I'm also very deeply involved in the innovation systems approach at the FARA, and I'm going to just talk about it based on the question raised by Dr. Irene. So some of the key lessons that I have, I believe are very critical when creating the systems are understanding the guiding principles for these approaches. And some of these principles would be like transparency and accountability, and just understanding who exactly gaining from these approaches, what are the incentives and what are these benefits. So as we're looking at farmers as investors in these approaches, then we are asking that what are the benefits for farmers, and do they understand this benefit? Is it clearly communicated to them when these approaches are designed by researchers and other value chain actors? And are they involved in the designing of these approaches? If they're involved, do they understand what it takes to be involved, and how much time it's going to get, they're going to get involved in these approaches? So just having a very clear, transparent, and accountable system is very important. And I believe also designing tools that produce evidence-based results on the application of these approaches is very critical, because then in the end, it provides a monitoring process for knowing the level of engagement of each value chain actor and what the demographic is, and this even helps investors in decision making. I also think, Dr. Irene, that capacity is important. It's been mentioned by by Dr. Madjojo, but then in this sense also understanding the language of researchers versus the language of farmers. So when you're looking at these approaches, then a lot of times, like in this forum, for example, we will be raising terms that are mostly understood by researchers, but then do farmers understand that? Do business people, the private sector, understand these terms as the same way researchers understand it? So if you have a platform that's with multi-stakeholders like researchers, extensionists, private sector, farmers, then are the same terms used by the researcher, the same terms used by private sector? When you talk about investments from a research point of view, is it the same term a private sector understands as investment, or the same way a farmer understands as investment? So demystifying these terms and speaking from a language that is understood by all is very critical. And I believe that once these platforms are established, these are some of the things that come out and needs to be addressed, because also farmers, like we've heard, have innovations that they produce, and we need to understand them as innovations from the farmer point of view. This also brings the element of co-creation and continuous business development. So once these terms are understood and this transparency in how the relationship works in the ecosystem, then it also provides a platform for entrepreneurial thinking, creativity, and business development. Lastly, I'd like to just mention that I think from the work we've done and what the progress that is being made in the sector is very commendable. However, we need to also establish a matrix of commercialization of these approaches, because in the end, we're talking about rewards and incentives, but do we know the value of these innovations? Do we understand the pricing mechanism, the costing mechanisms? And when I say we, I mean researchers, farmers, investors, private sector. do all partners understand the value of these technologies, these innovations and approaches? And having that matrix is very critical. At FARA, we are currently developing agribusiness learning alliances, which intend to continue these discussions and advocate for commercialization of these approaches. However, there needs to be a matrix that is fully understood by all the partners in the establishment of the innovations and the approaches, because it also guides in the investment, and it guides all the partners in the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. This really adds on to what we heard from Bridget and Joshua, but also what Jojo explained very clearly. Obviously, we're looking at multi-stakeholders, and farmers are key in that context. And you point out clearly the issue of involving them in the designing, so that they are there's equity in a way in terms of participating in the innovation process. And at the same time, bringing to the fore a common language, a currency that's shared on both sides. That for me is also very important. What's the language that we understand across board from farmers, researchers, private and public sector alike? Because we're talking about co-creation of innovation, and equity in understanding is important. I'm excited about the learning alliances that you talk about, and maybe at some good time we will see the emerging direction for the learning alliances. Now, this really brings me my interest to talking about the transaction costs for farmers. And I'd like to turn to Ishmael. In Bridget's presentation, she had mentioned the problem of transaction costs for farmers. And I think all the speakers are alluding to this. They take time that I think many of us take for granted in participating in innovation platform. For instance, the farmers are key, and Karen points to that. How do you think this should be managed, Ishmael? And what is the role farmers unions like yours could possibly play? You know, what is required to ensure this equity within the value chains? Ishmael, share your thoughts on this.
Thank you, moderator, for the question. I just also want to start by acknowledging the first presentation that expanded the boundaries of what research and innovation is. That is not only about products, it's not only about gadgets, it is also about processes, and it is also about organization. I think it's a good start, because quite often the problems that farmers are confronted with are not necessarily sitting in the gadgets. They are much more sitting in the entire chain. And I think what is important really, apart from the instruments, is really to go much deeper before the development of the instruments about on the issues around what actually is the end game. And from a farmer's perspective, it's so fundamentally important that if it doesn't improve their welfare, and never mind how good the gadget is, never mind how good the idea is, it's not going to work. So the question is, what is it that impinges on the welfare of farmers? And we all know that a lot of it is about fairness and equity in the distribution of risk and reward in the entire value chain. If innovation could just focus on that, just that piece alone, everything would be okay, because that is where the problem is. But guess what? Innovation is running in a different direction. It is not talking about balancing the power relations. That is a fundamental problem. You can increase productivity, efficiency all you want, but if the pipeline is blocked and it delivers poorly to you, it's not going to be very helpful. So my clarion call here is to ensure that research and innovation is aligned with the pain points of farmers. And this is critical. number one. And to do that, the agenda, the investor should be the farmer. It is the farmer who should define what should be the agenda for the research. It is not for them to be invited as beneficiaries, as target groups. No, that's the wrong conceptualization of things. They would value to bring their partners, colleagues mentioned co-creation before. So this is all, I think, the beginnings. How do we begin? It's important how we begin. So it's let's go on that. The other pain point, really, without wasting too much time, I understand we're running out of time, is about access to basic backbone infrastructure. How do you expect someone to innovate if you're out there in the hinterland where there's no power, there are no roads, there's no water, there's no energy, nothing? And then we're talking about innovation. The best place for innovation is how to deal with those things. Yeah. Before we start talking about how do we give them better seeds, how do we do that? No. The ABC of life is fundamental. So my core, again, without talking too much, my colleagues already highlighted a number of things, that let's locate research and innovation. The investors that are calling the shots should pinpoint that investment of inquiry in the right direction. And the right direction means the farmer should play a central part in the definition of what that direction. I'll end here just to allow others to take, then we'll move on discussion. Thanks all.
Thank you, Ishmael. Of course, if the pipeline is blocked, then no amount of increase in productivity is going to make a difference. That's really strong. Of course, you've touched on the issue of equity, and I would like to turn my attention to Jeffrey now. Jeffrey, can you tell us a little bit about, in your own experience, how do we support female farmers, for instance, in the value chain? We know that they are the most vulnerable. So as we talk about issues of equity and creating competitiveness and profitability, how do we ensure that they are key to access innovations and opportunities? Jeffrey, just very quickly, and then we will take a question or two from the chat room that Scarlett will bring to us.
Thank you very much. Geoffrey Okidi is my name. I'm currently the acting Chief Operating Officer at ABI Development. ABI Development is a social enterprise that has a vision of contributing to a competitive and sustainable agriculture and agribusiness in Uganda. We work largely using matching grants as the instrument, but also we combine it with business development services. So briefly, I note that innovation or innovation instruments are used in combination. And as at ABI, we have taken interest in particularly results-based financing. We think that it's a great way to spur innovation among our investors, but also it's a great way to leverage resources from the private sector. The question is, how do we equitably do this, particularly at ABI? There are a number of ways we do this. As I mentioned, we are into value chain development. So largely, one, we ensure that issues of gender are mainstreamed in all the interventions that we do. So gender mainstreaming means all programming has elements of including women, including the youth in whatever we do. We largely use the household approach in our interventions, farming as a business, farming as a family business. So as already mentioned previously by the other speakers, farmers are innovators in a way. So with the approach of farming being taken as a business, it means that there's inclusivity of everyone, the youth, the women in those interventions. We have done specific interventions with incubators, promoting the element of incubation that helps to include the youth into whatever we do, and that has also promoted into innovation. Furthermore, I think we have targeted interventions. to get everybody included. We have targeted interventions for the youth, targeted interventions for the women. For example, we have specific interventions to promote women in coffee, to get them moving. So basically, for us to promote innovation, I think that we need to have large-scale access to innovation opportunities for everyone and ensure participation of men, women, youth, and everyone else. So plus targeted innovations. Once we have all this, then equity will be assured and we'll have equitable wealth creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. This really adds to our discussion in terms of equity and driving innovation that involves the participation of all categories from the beginning of it to the impact. We're running out of time, so I want to stop here and ask Scarlett from the chat room if we have a burning question for any of the panelists. Scarlett, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Irene, and thanks everyone for your interesting presentations. So several people, including Mr. Sunga, mentioned the importance of starting with farmers and co-creation. And so this is to all of the panelists, but do you have any views on which instruments discussed here have been successful in promoting this?
Good. Is there a second one?
Yes, this is open to everyone. So starting with farmers and co-creation, do you understand which kind of instruments have been successful in promoting this kind of co-creation with farmers?
Okay, thank you. Can I have a volunteer, maybe Bridget? Do you want to come in? Because you wouldn't have a chance to respond to any of these issues. You want to respond, and then maybe another panelist can take it up. So the question is, which of the instruments that we're discussing actually pays attention to the involvement of farmers?
Thanks, Irene. So the sort of most obvious one would be farmer-driven innovation funds that actually allow farmers and generally smallholder farmers to not only define the research agenda, but lead the innovation process. And most of these innovation funds, there's actually a question about whether to call them funds or facilities, because often it's not just about resources, it's about access to, it's not only about financial resources, it's about access to other resources like knowledge, knowledge holders, or for example, maybe somebody's developing a new tool and needs access to some engineering support with it. So I think that those play a big role. I mentioned those local agricultural research committees in Latin America, and I found them very interesting because I think they've gone about reaching a point or supporting these committees to reach a point of maturity where they can function on their own. And I think maybe that's what one's got to try and achieve with all these things, a point of ownership and being able to continue without continued project support. It seemed that would be my input at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to use the same question as an opportunity for all the panelists. So as we round off, because we're running out of time, so you respond as you make your final statement. Karen, I'll come to you. I know that Farah, you've worked on the user-led process under the PIPAD project, and it's in a way part and parcel of the innovation platform. We're talking about instruments that have been successful in including farmers. Can you make a point on that as we conclude?
Thank you, Dr. Irene. I actually think the innovation platforms has been very successful so far because it has been adopted by our partners and institutions. We had a run through of all, for example, through the TAT program. TAT program is Technologies for Agricultural Technologies for Africa Agricultural Transformation by AFDB. And we realized that from the 10 organizations that were involved in that program, all of them use innovation platforms to scale their technologies and involve farmers in these processes. And that's just one example. We have a showcase of a lot of other countries that have adopted it through the national agricultural research organizations, going to the ground, the grassroots to reach farmers. However, I would also like to add a disclaimer, Dr. Irene, on this. From my experience, I don't think there's a one shoe fits all. This is because the demography of farmers is very wide, and we have large scale, small scale, rural farmers, urban farmers, young farmers, elderly farmers. So I believe that the different approaches work for different demographies. And it would be interesting maybe to characterize even these innovations and see which one works best for which demography. Those are my concluding remarks. Thank you for the attention.
We have just 4 minutes to end. May I have Ishmael 1 second to make a concluding statement?
It would be difficult. 1 second could be, okay, 1 second could be a bit of a long shot, but let me try. I still think, at the risk of repeating myself, that let's look at the concept itself before the instruments, and let's make sure that we are measuring the right thing. And innovation is supposed to change people's livelihoods, and so let's locate that focus in terms of measuring outputs, not necessarily in academic publications or an adoption that don't end up with improving people's lives. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Jeffrey?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Innovation is key. We should continue to drive it and disseminate it on large scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And my colleague, Commissioner Majojo, 1 second.
Yes, maybe just to say that probably innovation should be looked at from a strategic point of view, not one innovation or another, but have a bundle, a package of innovation touching at all the level of the innovation itself, but also at the enabling environment, and to have it in a sustained way for many years instead of as a project type of innovation. That is, I think, that what I take from the discussion.
Thank you so much. I think we've all coalesced around the importance of sustainability, which is what COSI is about. How do we influence the enabling environment for investment? Enabling environment for innovations will be based on how we involve all partners on the innovation to impact pathway, and how we incentivize different actors, how we acknowledge and don't take for granted that everyone else in the pathway is investing one way or the other, and that those transaction costs need to be taken on board. So I think this has been very exciting, and for Bridget and your team, I think we've given you a few pointers that should help in guiding the way forward for the remainder of the study. I'm excited to end this session, and on behalf of COSI and of course NIR and partners on this study, I wish to thank the AGRF for giving us the platform to have this very interesting discussion. I'm grateful to all the speakers who were able to come on time, even though it was quite early, to help us discuss this very exciting topic. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to, of course, the support of the Commission, and of course, all the partners who were participants who were able to join us across the globe. We are so happy, and the chat will continue, so please keep putting through your questions, and we'll have a bit of discussion in the chat room. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and we'll see you again another time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.